And once again, a very nice welcome to another Dutcham webinar here on this Thursday afternoon, sunny afternoon in São Paulo, hopefully also in Rio and in the rest of Brazil. We're ready and off to go for another webinar, this time on a very nice topic as well, on compliance and ethics, because this is apparently also the moment to talk about this subject. I'm happy that a lot of people registered for this event, and meanwhile that people are getting into the meeting room bit by bit, let me also give you some practical things to give you before we start off. First of all, if you are disconnected during the call, don't worry, just go back to your link, click again and rejoin the meeting again. It's as easy as that. Obviously, we will not see you, we will not hear you. This is the way it goes in a webinar, but it doesn't mean that you cannot connect with us. So please feel free to use your chat box or the Q&A that you have into this webinar, and feel free to ask the questions that you want to our panel. Because luckily, I'm not alone in this webinar. I have the assistance of a few top experts with me today. And kicking off officially this webinar, then allow me to introduce first of all to you our first guest of this afternoon, Geert Aalbers, partner at Control Risks. Geert, a very warm welcome to this webinar this afternoon. Good to have you with us in this panel. Secondly, I would like to welcome also Christina Bezerra from Group Makro. She is Ethics and Compliance Officer at Group Makro. Christina, nice to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
And you're in the red of Makro, right?
Yeah.
Good
Always.
To have always. And also welcome to Patricia Vasconcellos from SBM Offshore, straight from Rio. Hi, Patricia.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hi. You're not dressed in red, but you have painted the wall in red, especially for this for this webinar. Hey, I see that still a lot of people need to come into the meeting room, apparently a bit late, all of us, but no worries. Let's kick off already this chat with you. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Well, before maybe tackling the real topic of today, just maybe have a small introduction of yourself, because not everybody knows you. So maybe you can just introduce yourself quickly with the company, something to say about the company, and obviously also your role within the company. Let me start with Patricia.
Hello, everybody. So I am Patricia Vasconcellos. I am the compliance manager for SBM Offshore. So this is a company that is obviously in the offshore business, and that means that the company does design, supply, installation, and operational platforms, so FPSOs. So we have some particularities, let's say, of our business, because we're done mainly offshore. In Brazil, we are about 1,500 employees, and responsible for compliance here in Brazil, where we have a very big chunk of our workforce.
Okay, great to have you with us, Patricia. Christina.
So first of all, thank you again, Peggy and Dutcham, for promoting this discussion. You know how passionate I am about the topic of compliance, so it's a pleasure to share this panel with Patricia and Geert. I work for Makro. Makro is part of SHV Holdings. It's a wholesaler with business in 5 countries in South America, with around 10,000 employees and over 120 stores.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christina. Geert.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Peggy, for the invitation, and great to be on the webinar here with Christina and Patricia. My name is Geert. I run Control Risks. I'm a partner at Control Risks here in Brazil, and on the executive committee globally. And as probably some of you know, we are essentially a global risk consultancy, and that involves working on many compliance risk issues, investigations, and the like. And I'm sure we'll touch upon many of those topics in the course of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, nice to have you with us, Geert. I think indeed it comes down to risks now and management of risks. There is a lot of things to say about it these days. And tackling immediately the subject of today, why all of a sudden is compliance such a huge or such a massive hot topic these days? Are companies facing now more risk, different risks because of the pandemic? How do you see that?
So I think just to start off, if we look back in history, and I promise to make this short, but if we look back in history, almost every time there's a major crisis, it ends up being a generator for corruption and fraud risk issues, independently of the nature of the crisis. It could be a natural disaster, it could be fraud and corruption related, obviously, but in this case, pandemic. We have situations where new risks surface for companies, and particularly, and I think most people on the webinar today will be able to relate to that. We have relative new situations like massive amounts of government funding and stimulus packages and the like, which can create significant risk issues if they're not properly managed. We have emergency spending in very large amounts. I think most of us are familiar with that. Donations by companies to government. And a really important one, a more mundane operational one, is significant disruption in supply chain, for example. And because of significant disruption in supply chain, many companies, and at both ends, right, both from the supplier of raw materials all the way through clients and distribution, companies are suddenly forced to very quickly change around suppliers or potentially look for new commercial strategies, even as part of a survival strategy. Things that they were sourcing from Asia or so a couple of months ago, absolutely impossible. They need to source much closer to home. And they need to bring on, for example, suppliers very quickly, new suppliers, and that can create huge opportunities, obviously, for wrongdoing. So suffice to say, when we have crises, we have changes in the risk profiles, and also we have a situation which employees, for example, are under pressure. We have companies trying to make up for lost ground, in survival mode. So the incentives, unfortunately, for wrongdoing are also heightened.
Mm-hmm. And also the fact that people are working remotely, which obviously gives
that aggravates the situation. Absolutely.
Exactly. Now, I assume that you recognize these, let's say, more the theory of it, but you've seen this in practice, I think, Christina and Patricia.
Yes, exactly. So all of the examples that Geert had, I can see most of them. So we recently had a case of a company. So we were procuring some items that we don't usually procure due to the pandemic. So we go and seek for new suppliers, for example. And one of these new suppliers that we were looking for, once they came into the due diligence process, then we realized some things that were not quite right. They were a little bit off if you're looking at their proposal and the prices, and then the company that didn't quite match, and it looked a lot like fraud. So what we see increasing a lot nowadays is other companies and people trying to take advantage of this unfortunate situation that we're in. So what we have learned, I would not say the hard way, because in the end nothing happened, thankfully. Our due diligence worked, but there are more attempts, I think, of fraud, seeing how companies might let their guards down in regards to compliance issues due to the pressure, due to the increased opportunities for fraud, and due to the rationalization of the whole thing. So there are examples that you can see on your day-to-day life of this being attempted. So trying to disrupt the life of the company like that. So this is one thing that I always say is that we should not relax on that regard. So keeping the due diligence as it always was is what kept us safe, and that's what we think happened. So yes, I do. There are examples of those things happening for sure on our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I think the same at Makro Group, right, Christina?
Yeah, well, I think many companies are experiencing the same risks as Geert just said. At Makro, we have a difference in relation to some companies because as we are in the essential business, we are still providing services. So our stores continue operating as we deliver food and other products that our customers need. So, of course, our number one priority was regarding our people and our customers. So it was more related to the safety and ensuring people are safe. But also, of course, on some other aspects of ethics and compliance, we saw the increase of risks. So, for example, competition risks. We saw today CADE, the antitrust authorities in Brazil, scheduled their first extraordinary meeting to analyze and probably approve one of the requests of companies to do things together to overcome the crisis. So going back to what I was saying is that it is natural that companies that are still operating, they want to get together with other peers to understand how they will do this in the best way and in the safest way possible. But getting together with competitors, not always a good idea if not done properly. So we saw the competition risks increasing, but on the other hand, we anticipated that and we had permanent discussions with management to ensure people knew what to do and what not to do. This is one example. The other example that I wanted to mention, and Geert mentioned that, was donations, right? So at Makro, we are very strong in our social responsibility, always. But in situations like this, of course, there are more opportunities to do good and to help the communities where we operate. But sometimes a request of donations can be a disguise for improper payments. So also we had to make sure that everybody knew and behaved according to our donations policy. So these are my two examples.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, talking about this, because obviously, I mean, ethics and compliance is always around in the company, but do you think that, and maybe towards Geert, this current situation, Corona crisis, has been changed the focus then for companies? Have they been pushed, to change a bit their attitude towards compliance?
I think I don't think it necessarily changes things. I think it probably emphasizes certain parts of a compliance program, the importance of them more. So I think, first of all, it's important to state at the outset that governments globally, and that includes Brazil, have been absolutely clear and unequivocal in their commitment that they will tackle any signs of corruption or wrongdoing related to COVID-19 very harshly, which means it's a high-risk area. When we look at the companies and their capacity to kind of navigate through this crisis from a compliance point of view, the one thing I would emphasize very, very strongly, and I think it often gets overlooked, is the risk assessment. And the reason I mention that is because very often a risk assessment, so basically a tool whereby you look at all your key processes, areas, interactions with government, for example, and where you are most exposed to compliance risks. As I mentioned at the outset, there are very specific types of risks which have surfaced. Maybe some risks which weren't high probability, high impact in the past are now much more so. When we look at measuring and evaluating maturity of compliance programs and risk assessments specifically, one of the key criteria is to determine or to assess whether these risk assessments are being refreshed periodically. So the first thing I would say is make sure you refresh your risk assessment. And the reason why that's important is because every piece of anti-corruption legislation, and I'm not saying you just do it because legislation asks you to do it, but every single piece of international legislation, whether it be OECD or FCPA or UK bribery or the Brazilian anti-corruption laws, specify specifically that you will only consider to have a effective, robust compliance program if it is risk-based. And the only way you can make it risk-based is if you conduct a risk assessment. Once you do your risk assessment, you can determine much more clearly where you're going to spend resources, because they're scarce. You can ask Christina and Patricia, they don't have infinite resources to spend on training and due diligence and whistleblowing line and internal investigations. So it allows you to properly and prioritize the areas where the company has the highest risk. So I would just say at this stage within compliance, I think refreshing the risk assessment is probably one of the key starting points for being prepared and resilient in this crisis.
Is this something also at the SBM that has been done immediately since the beginning of the crisis, Patricia? This review and reshape the risk assessment of the risk management procedures?
Yes, for sure. So as Geert mentioned, the risk assessment is the first thing that you look at again. And as we have mentioned before, our new ways of working, the fact that we're working from home, these kinds of things are aspects that have to be taken into consideration when you're talking about how are you going to reach out to people now. So different efforts in communication, for example, are key in that case, because then you have to make sure that your message is getting through, even though people are not in the office every day, they're not looking at you, they're not seeing the posters that you put on the walls with so much care now. And you have to make sure that they are able to have access to you and all of those things. So one example of that is different ways of communicating with people and making ourselves available that we had to do again to make sure that we were up to the task of providing our compliance advisory as we always did in the past. So that's one thing, for example. We have also, as Christina mentioned, shifting the focus a lot to the charitable contributions part. Not that we didn't do in the past, but now we have this eagerness of the company, of course, also to give back to the community and to be part of the community. And that resonates with all parts of the supply chain, of course, because you're acquiring the goods and you're donating the goods. And in all of those phases of the process, you have to be aware on how you're going to do that. Now, there might be governmental officials involved, for example, because, of course, you want to help communities, you want to reach out to hospitals, you want to make sure that the community that the company is inserted is getting also the appropriate help as far as we can. So we had also to reshift the focus for those things. So those are two examples of things that are now on the forefront of our worries, that not that we were not looking at them before, but they're on top of mind kind of thing.
Pushed by the pandemic. Christina, same for you. I mean, I hear here talking also about the communication, the way of communication, but obviously it's not only about communication. What has changed? What has pushed the Makro Group, let's say, in a different focus or in?
Well, communication for us is always key. I could spend hours talking about communication, because in our case, especially having people all over the stores, we really feel we need to reach out to these people and tell them how we expect them to behave, and also listen to them and understand what their issues are on a daily basis. So I think because of the pandemic, people realized even more that communication is key. We are finding different ways to communicate, mainly digitally now, but I have a saying, and Geert was with me probably when I heard this. We were at a panel once, and we heard the speaker saying, compliance speaks louder through the mouth of the business. And for me, this is key, because if I do speak about ethics and compliance, people think, well, she's paid to do that, right? That's her job. So when people listen to their managers talking about ethics and compliance and how ethics and compliance is a non-negotiable for the company, I think it is a lot stronger. So we kept one of our, rituals, that every meeting at Makro, we start by talking about ethics and compliance. We have a very simple ethics and compliance slide, but we use it for every meeting that we have. Also, we already had some other ways to communicate with the stores. For instance, there's one channel called TV Makro. Our town halls that used to be on the floor, now they became lives. So I was in some of these opportunities basically to show my face and say, hey guys, we're still here. Compliance still matters for this company, especially in times of crisis. This is what bonds us. This is the glue that makes us so proud for working for this company. And one message that I think was important to convey is that our Speak Up channel, which is our hotline, is still working. I think this is important, that people be reassured that this didn't change. Investigation is a different aspect, but it is still working and we're still there to listen to them.
Before going to investigations, because I think this is a very key point to discuss when you talk about compliance, but let me just come back to Geert, because Geert, you were saying, okay, the whole risk management companies should have a look again at their risk management procedures, put in question their procedures. But obviously this COVID crisis has taken all of us in speed, right? I mean, it came all of a sudden. I mean, what would be your advice to companies? Because nobody has been prepared for this crisis. You're the experts in risk management. What is your advice to companies? How to catch up with this quickly?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the hallmarks of an effective risk management and compliance program, and I would consider compliance within, you know, in some sense, a form of risk management, right? It's a very specific risk you're trying to manage, or risk of non-compliance, is the flexibility and resilience. So it's you know, when you map risks, you know, many people call pandemic a black swan, right? We've heard that everyone came out of nowhere. It's not really that much of a black swan. I mean, pandemic risk is a known risk category. We've had Ebola, we've had SARS, we've had all kinds of health risks. It's just that this one really, became a global crisis almost immediately. You know, we may have underestimated the impact of this pandemic risk, but the pandemic risk itself has always kind of been there. So the first point to state is, you know, it's not necessarily a failing of companies, you know, that suddenly find themselves wrong guarded or whatever. It's not a failing of the risk management system. It's maybe we had underestimated, you know, the actual risk. The pandemic risk should always be there on the risk radar.
Except from Bill Gates. Except from Bill Gates, because he already announced it a few years ago.
Exactly. Well, yeah, it had been, yeah. But the key point is, I think, well, the first one is, if the organization is serious about compliance, and I think the hallmark of seriousness about compliance is that it's not just compliance talking about it, that it's actually embedded in the culture, and that it really comes, you know, I mean, I hate to say it because it sounds so staid, but tone from the top. If you don't perceive that there's a real commitment from key executives, you know, from not just the CEO, but the main influencers and decision makers in the organization, that compliance is important, then forget everything else we're talking about here on this particular webinar, because nothing else is going to be very helpful. But I would go back to, you know, the importance of, and you can do this very, very quickly, you can do this very effectively, but the importance of, either through interviews or small, you know, you can have virtual workshops, to identify what's really changed over the past, whatever, 1 month, 2 months, or since January, when people maybe were concerned what was happening in China and maybe about some of the suppliers they had in China and business continuity, but certainly not thinking about closing down offices and going to remote working two months later, right? But what's actually changed in this period? Where have the operational procedures changed? Where do we need to adapt strategy, and what kind of risks does that generate for compliance? And it's it's equally valid for a company that hasn't started on this journey yet, as it is for a company that already has this in a more mature way. Obviously, for a company that's done this in as part of a, let's say, a routine refresh within their compliance program, as most companies should be doing, it'll be relatively easy. The language is easy to understand, and I think people understand the purpose of it. But even with companies that have never done anything in compliance, now is not a bad time to start. I would, again, just emphasize the critical importance of starting with a risk assessment rather than jumping to, oh, we need to implement a third-party program, we need to do training, because it could be very haphazard, very disoriented, without necessarily prioritizing the areas that are most potentially impactful to the business.
Of course, then I think we come to another topic that we already touched very quickly, and I see also one of the people in the audience is putting this in the chat box. If it comes down to resources, because I mean, obviously, I mean, a lot of companies are under a lot of pressure, and then it comes down to resources as well. I mean, how do you manage that? Maybe it's a question to Christina or to Patricia. How do you deal with that?
Yes, that is something that all companies are going to have to face. And I cannot give a different answer than analyzing your own risks. Again, we always seem to come back to the same topic. But, companies have to adapt to new realities, and this is something that has always happened and will always happen. And as Geert just mentioned, it's not the first time, it's not going to be the last. I think what the company has to be very aware of is what are their values. And they should not compromise their key values if you're a serious company, if you're trying to remain relevant in the market, because of those things. So adapting, yes, of course, everybody understands that. And when you talk about risk, you're not only talking about compliance risk. If you're going to do a risk profile for your company, you're going to see, okay, are my clients different now? Are my areas where I'm acting now, are they different? Am I not doing this anymore? So I used to have a very strong gift and hospitalities, and now I'm not doing that anymore. So am I stepping back in that because that's not really an issue for me anymore? So all of those things have to be taken into consideration before you decide, okay, am I going to put my resources here or there? How is your company? How does it look right now? How can I adapt to what it has become after the reality that we're in right now? And then from there, you go and see where you can adapt your resources, of course. And so for me, that's it. But you should never compromise your values in that regard. So compliance has to be embedded, and you have to analyze how is your company going to implement that in their day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a lot about agility. Sorry, here.
No, I just want to emphasize based on the question that was asked. So, do you feel that basic concept of segregation of duties can be compromised? The answer is yes, absolutely. And this is one of the key, can be compromised. I'm not saying it should be. I'm understanding the question, meaning that there's a risk that happens. And absolutely there is. And that's one of the big problems with taking your foot off the gas with compliance, internal controls and exactly in an environment like this. The one thing I would emphasize though is the following, that, and I think, most people are familiar with that, but there is the concept of, the 3 levels, of control. So you have your frontline managers who are dealing with the compliance risks on a day-to-day basis. That's your operations managers, your sales guys, your finance people. Then you have, your second layer of control, which is essentially the experts in risk management, in compliance, in controls and the like. That's pretty much, the Christinas and the Patricias here who help the first line audit. What happens in a situation like this is very often the second part. So budgets of compliance get cut, compliance teams get cut. Maybe we talk about that as well. And there's more and more emphasis then and need to make sure that the first line of defense is up to speed on the different kinds of risks. So even if internal controls are being bypassed or they're being, procedures are being cut or whatever for emergency purposes, it's all about making sure that the front line is prepared. And that a lot of that has to do with culture and a lot of that has to do with training. And, there is no magic bullet. If you start breaking down internal controls, if you pull out compliance, you're going to have problems as a company. I mean, that's a simple message. It's ultimately a trade-off between running higher compliance risk and having lower costs in the organization, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Christina, you wanted to add something to that?
I'm saying I fully agree. I think when you have a very strong culture, sometimes we talk about the soft controls and the hard controls, right? So they have to walk side by side. When you do have a very strong culture, when people really are empowered to take good decisions and they know what is expected from them, I think that even if you do not have that budget that you hoped you had, you still can get a strong compliance program. But of course, I think as compliance officers need also to be very wise on how we spend the company budgets, right? So always finding ways to do more with less, or to be more creative. And I think this pandemic is also making us rethink the way we work. Many companies had to change from offline to online, from day to night. Companies that did not deliver now are delivering. So, people can be challenged and get better, get stronger. So I think we as compliance officers should also learn how to do it and run the ethics and compliance department as any other business or function within the company.
Okay. Now, coming back on the investigations, because it's very key, but it's not so easy, especially when you're in a remote environment. How do you handle this? How do you manage this, Patricia, maybe?
So yes, that's another very hot topic, of course. And as you mentioned, as for everything else, that also cannot stop. So we did have to be very creative. In our industry, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of units that are offshore. So that's always kind of an issue for us, access to them. So we have over, almost 1,000 employees who are offshore. And we have to find ways of communicating with them. So it's not the most ideal situation, but whenever we can, we did not stop any of our investigations. We decided to go ahead with them, even in the situation which is not ideal right now, but putting the brake to what we were doing was not really an option, because we have to make sure, and as Christina had said before, we are making sure that our employees are very aware that the integrity line is still working, that they can still reach out to us, and that things did not become okay that were not okay before. So we are also always vigilant to any breaches or the code of conduct or anything that is not supposed to be done. And everything is still in place regarding that. So it was very important, and it was a conversation in our company that we would not stop doing that. It never took a break. Let's just say that. It was adapted to the current situation as everything else. So everything that can be done remotely, even interviews, and we have tried different digital solutions or better ways of communicating with people who are not in the same room as you. But it's still going on, and this is something that I find very important, that your employees can rely on the fact that that is still working.
Geert, maybe as an expert, are these ways of investigation, let's say, as reliable as what you do in a face-to-face? Because obviously it's different. It's not the same.
Yeah, no, it's not the same. And I think if you ask anyone who conducts investigations professionally, whether it be in the private sector or, it could be internal audit, could be compliance, or in the public sector, enforcers, there's nothing really that substitutes a face-to-face interview. But the question I think Patricia raised correctly, the first question you have is, can we just wait until we're back in the office and start investigating then? And I mean, it sounds like a pretty logical question. Most cases, the answer is probably no, because information gets old, devices go missing, people go missing, or people simply leave the organization. But you may have situations where you receive a whistleblowing line about an internal fraud that happened in 2017 related to two employees who work together who have since left the organization. It's not that urgent. It's important to look at, but you may want to park that and do that later. But if you're dealing with a regulatory matter, we already know from government guidance that they're not going to be very forgiving, at least not conducting investigations because, the timing's not right or whatever, or there's no budget or something. It's not going to be a very good excuse. They will be forgiving, I think, in more understanding, given the constraints that there are in conducting investigations at the time. And I'd like to point out too, one of them we just briefly mentioned, which are interviews. The fact that you cannot interview people, or it's more difficult to interview people, in the same room, has a couple of limitations. Obviously, one of them, let's be frank, it's for many people who are being interviewed, they don't necessarily feel comfortable being interviewed over video conference. So there's a dynamic thing there as well. But the flip side as well, many times during interviews, and particularly confrontational interviews towards the back end of an investigation, when you've already gathered evidence, it's quite normal to present bits of evidence to an individual and ask them to comment and the like. And that kind of dynamic is very difficult. You present bits of evidence on a screen. They may take screenshots, which might not be very desirable. They may be recording and you don't know about that. They may be being canceled on the side. You don't know who else is in the room. So these kind of considerations are really important. Some people also want to have their own counsel together. If it's something which has criminal implications, which many regulatory matters have, they like to have counsel together, and that's difficult, obviously, remotely. So interviews, you can do them, and they can be reasonably effective remotely, and we do quite a lot of them, and I think we should continue to do them, but they definitely aren't the same as in person. And the second area is really around data collection. So as a standard part of any investigation, we would collect communications, financial information, but certainly emails, chats, and mobile phones and the like. And if you don't have access to the physical device, very often you can get it from the cloud or from the server or whatever it may be. But sometimes the procedures that need to be deployed for more serious regulatory investigations, the forensics procedures with notarial acts and the like, to make sure that you have the right procedure in place, the right probative value of that evidence, are not possible. So what you do then, you do what's possible, you document why it wasn't possible to follow standard procedures, and as soon as circumstances allow, you can then do let's say another collection to make sure that the data is properly preserved. One other thing I just like to add, and I think we are all very familiar with this at this stage, the amount of data and information available right now. So let's say we're investigating something current, has just exploded, because all of our communications over the past weeks have been via email, WhatsApp, or Teams, Zoom, Google Hangouts, and all of these platforms, for example, have registrations of who was on when they entered, when they left, which chats, what was asked, what was stated, the recordings, and that's just a lot more information to look into. So that's, in some sense, good for an investigation, but it also poses its own challenges. So I just want to highlight those two. There are many other elements, but I think those two are probably sufficient for now.
Yeah, indeed, because otherwise we're going completely out of time. But what you said is indeed is someday, well, the 1 million question will be probably when we'll be back to normal, when we'll be back all to the office and then back to normal life. But looking forward, how will compliance be influenced as such after the pandemic? How will compliance look like after this pandemic? Because we are going through a lot of changes, a lot of different focus. Patricia, Christina, how do you see compliance in the future?
Well, I think that reputation will remain key, will remain key. This morning I was reading news about a company, I will not mention the name, but the company that decided to dismiss the employees and not pay full severance based on an interpretation of an article of the labor laws, and then they went back and decided to do the right thing. So I saw many comments, and I think about the reputation of this company. It's damaged, and it was a poor decision, I believe. So I think there will be new areas of concern, especially considering that more people will continue to work from home, imagining that more people will continue to work from home. We were talking earlier about more concerns about cybersecurity, privacy, the policies of bring your own device. If you do not have one, please take a look at that. It's important to make sure the rules are clear. Also, I think there will be more digital training sessions, so we should get used to talking to computers rather than face-to-face. And perhaps less travel, which is sometimes difficult for us compliance who like to be close to the business and know what's going on and have the feel of the issues. So we will have to find creative ways. And I think more M&A. There will be companies out there willing to buy other companies, and we will be probably required to do more M&A due diligence, pre-acquisition, and also post-integration when the merge is finalized.
Other things to add, Patricia, from your side? So in the question, how do you see the future and the changes?
Yeah, I think Christina's list was very comprehensive of all the changes that we foresee. But, you know, compliance is in the business of reinventing itself all the time. And this is just one more turn that we're taking right now. So there was already something that we have been discussing a lot, which is how to make compliance more approachable, you know, a topic that everybody wants to be a part of or more fun. And for example, that's one thing that we're going to reinvent again now from afar. So we have other initiatives, you know, can you have a compliance theme puzzle to do at home with your family and talk about those things at home, for example, and see how you can embed them on your day-to-day life. So that's one thing, for example, that can be done from afar. I think that everybody here has experienced one Zoom talk where there's family going by, you know, just on the background.
The dog in the back and the cat, and the children in the back.
Exactly. So let's embrace that then. Let's call them to the meeting as well and have a fun game with them, with compliance things, just reminding people of, okay, do you remember this is our values? You know, do you remember this is our principle? Trying to embed it in our day-to-day life even more than we were before, and now from home. So it's just one more reinvention that we're going to have to do with ourselves, and we already did that a lot of times until now.
We will get better and better in all this Zoom and of online meetings, right? Bit by bit, we're getting specialists in it. Talking about digitalization, then I come back to Geert, because he already mentioned something before this webinar, just between us, mentioning something about the use of technology in the future. You have a clear idea on that, right?
I have an idea. I don't know how clear it is, but I think the reality is, you know, whenever we talk about technology, I mean, the one thing all organizations, and I think a question just came in about, you know, data and protection of data and data breaches and the like, we can try and address that afterwards as well. But I think one of the key characteristics of our time is that, all organizations, some shape or form, are rapidly digitalizing, right? More and more is about data, the communications, transactions, everything's translated into data. And as a result, the use of technology to identify anomalies, so to prevent, detect, and deter fraud and corruption, for example, is increasing. There's a bit of, I think there's a bit of hype around this in the sense that, everyone talks about machine learning and artificial intelligence as if it's the easiest thing to apply. And quite frankly, I think we're still quite far away from, using that in an effective manner in compliance. But there are definitely tools out there which will help us in that direction. We're, for example, seeing more and more, teams, whether it be internal audit or compliance teams, using data analytics in looking, trying to track anomalous financial transactions that need to be looked at, or, for example, sentiment analysis in emails, so they can pick up emails which look a little bit strange, or other types of simple things like user behavior, who is accessing, folders which are, or trying to access folders which are confidential, or uploading documents into Dropbox, or forwarding to their own personal emails. And I think that is, with the future of compliance is definitely going to hinge very much on the successful deployment of technology. We see that accelerating, and in some respects, it's also an efficiency play, because very often you get the, oh, well, technology is expensive. First of all, it's getting more and more cheap, or it's getting cheaper and cheaper. And the second thing is, don't forget how much time organizations spend on things like management review, internal audit, investigations, and the like, which are reactive and expensive. So I think expensive or high cost is quite relative. If you can prevent it at the front end, you can certainly, not only financially, but also reputationally, save the company a lot of headache and damage.
Yeah. Exactly. I also look at a question that comes from out of the audience, and then I would like to put that with Christina and with Patricia. Indeed, I think that this person's right. I mean, we changed very quickly into this new situation with the COVID, and then you might have the IT departments who have been struggling by catching up with the specific measures in order of protecting data, in order of protecting people who are going now completely remotely. Have you got some experience with that? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think someone from the IT department probably could answer this a little bit better, but we did have a case of someone trying to damage our network, and that I know that meant that the entire IT department had to work overnight to make sure that we were not under attack. So I think we can definitely experience or predict to experience a little bit more of attempts of that happening, because of all of the elements that we mentioned that are just more prone to causing these increases in risk right now. And I think they will have to catch up to that kind of menace that is coming our way, because for sure it is. With the increased use of these technologies, of course, everything that comes with it is going to come together, and that means also those kinds of attacks are trying to steal confidential data, so they will have to catch up for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just on that point as well, I think the general answer to that is no, there probably wasn't enough time to prepare for this, not on such a massive scale. So, the occasional individual working remotely is one thing. Your entire office, in case of a services provider or, headquarters of a company or whatever, working at home simultaneously is something quite different. Also, because the threat has changed, so threat actors like cyber criminals are obviously targeting, they're off the streets and into the cyberspace, and they're targeting remote workers very heavily. So the risk the threat has actually increased. The vulnerability of a home network undoubtedly is going to be significantly higher than most corporate configured networks. So I think that's an important element as well. And quite frankly, it's not just about the outside criminal breach, phishing, sending Trojan horses or trying to hijack information or steal information. It's also more importantly, or not more importantly, but perhaps equally importantly, the rogue employee who steals secrets and prints stuff and uses his own devices at home quite freely without any supervision, and may be able to do things at home that he's not able to do in the office. So I think it's a very pertinent question, and it is a very significant vulnerability, and we know many companies are very concerned about the increased vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll look at another question, interesting one that comes in. Is there an index on compliance for cost per capita per country, and how does Brazil is in this ranking? Maybe it's again a question to answer for Geert.
I'll leave that for Patricia and Christina so they can lobby for higher salaries. I'm not aware of I'm not aware of any index. So it's just an education, yes, right? But I suspect that the cost, expense, or investments, or whatever, in compliance in Brazil, where it's a rapidly maturing, but it's still a maturing industry, are probably lower than in Europe or United States, or where they're more established departments. But again, that's really there is no scientific research done about that. We don't. Not that I'm aware of. It may be there, but I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, I'm not aware either. I am aware of they do have some benchmarks on salary, on the quantity of people you have in your department. There's a question comparing Makro Brazil with Makro Netherlands. Makro Netherlands doesn't belong to SHV, so I wouldn't know that. But comparing Makro with other SHV groups, I believe we invest pretty much the same. But as Geert said, and I've been around in compliance for over 20 years now, and I've seen that companies are investing a lot more recently, especially after the Lava Jato, the car wash operation. Companies are taking this matter more seriously than before. It depends on the size of the company, the industry of the company. I would love to see one index like that, but I don't know.
And this question is probably indeed a bit linked indeed to maybe the image of Brazil as fighting against corruption. Maybe this is a bit linked to this, but again, here too, you have the impression, because you compare a lot of different countries, especially here in Latin America, do you have the impression that the investments overall on compliance from companies is higher compared to other countries?
In Brazil? Mm-hmm. Again, I don't have the data on the investments. What I can state very, I think, confidently is that the degree of maturity and development of compliance here in Brazil is probably well ahead of pretty much every other country in Latin America. And that is because of the significant crackdown enforcement enforcement on corruption over the past 5 years or so. It's created, as I said, it's been a very rapid development and maturing of the compliance industry. And it's, quite frankly, I think the Brazilian compliance area is one of the most dynamic globally, because you look at Europe and for example, the United States. Of course, there are many areas of compliance you could be looking into, but most of those areas are quite stable in some regard. They're quite matured, and what you see here is there's a greater level of dynamism, also because of some of the particular characteristics of the market. There's a overall kind of a younger compliance community, people who are moving into this, who are very often more tech savvy, who are kind of more of an entrepreneurial drive. So you notice a different dynamism here, which is actually quite I think, encouraging for the future of compliance here in Brazil. But it does require that companies continue to support and sponsor compliance programs and professionals.
Okay, well, this is maybe your last advice to the audience here, that companies continue investing more on compliance, or something else that you want to end with?
No, the only thing I would say is, and you know, probably people have heard this from others, but just because the situation's changed, don't forget that the rules have not. And I think it's really important to stick the course.
Okay, thank you very much. Patricia, some last advice to share with the audience?
Yeah, I could not agree more with what Geert just said. But it's just to remain approachable. People, of course, it's a time when everybody is trying to figure out how they're going to handle the situation. So are we. But they will need the guidance of everyone, of course, top management, but as a compliance professional, have to be within reach of the people who will seek that guidance. So make it accessible and just be accessible yourself also. And I think together, everybody's going to go through this.
Okay, well, thanks for being accessible for us as well, Patricia. Christina, last word to you. Last advice to the audience before we close.
Oh, what a responsibility. I think building on what they said, and by being around for a while, I think that I saw compliance changing and broadening the areas where we help the companies to do good business. And I've always seen this progressing. So I don't think this is going to change. I think some years from now, we will remember this situation by saying we came out of it stronger, better, and maybe different, using more technology or taking more care of people. So my message is positive. I think let's just continue on the right path.
Okay, well, I think I could not have ended better with a more positive message than what you did, Christina. Allow me to thank you, all of you, once again here, Patricia, Christina, for adding so much value on the table today. I would have preferred to do this with you as we did in the past in a very live way. Then I would have been able to hug you and kiss you and have a drink afterwards with you.
We'll do that soon.
Which is not possible, but it doesn't mean that we cannot have a drink tonight at home, all of us. But thank you very much for this nice talk with you. It was a pleasure welcoming you again at Dutcham. Keep safe and keep connected with Dutcham.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you everyone who joined. Bye-bye.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you, everybody.
See you all.
See you.
See you, and thanks to the audience for following this session. Thank you very much. See you all soon.